The smell of the paddock was something you either loved or you learned to live with. Thea had spent enough years around professional sport to know that every venue had its own particular cocktail of sensory assault, but Formula One was different from anything she had worked in before. It was the fuel, mostly, a sharp, almost chemical sweetness that coated the back of your throat and stayed there long after you had left the circuit. Mixed with it was the rubber from tires ground into fine dust and carried on the wind, the metallic tang of hot brake components cooling in the shade of the garage, and underneath all of it, the ever-present, low-frequency anxiety of enormous amounts of money riding on the performance of two cars and the fragile human beings strapped inside them. Thea carried her medical bag through the controlled chaos of the Apex Racing Garage on the first official day of pre-season testing and tried to look like she belonged. She did belong. She had the contract to prove it. 3 years of physiotherapy work with professional cycling and 2 with a Premier League football club behind her, and the explicit endorsement of the team's head physician, Dr. Brennan, who had recruited her over the phone in November with the words, "You are exactly what this team needs, and I will not take no for an answer." She belonged. She just hadn't figured out how to feel that yet. The garage was enormous and immaculate in the way that only things bankrolled by 9-figure sponsorship deals could be. The floors were cleaner than most operating rooms. The equipment was arranged with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Mechanics in the team's signature dark red and charcoal uniforms moved around the two bolids with the careful choreography of people who had performed these exact movements thousands of times and knew that a single mistake in this environment could cascade into disaster at 250 kilometers per hour. Thea had read the briefing documents on the plane from London. She knew both drivers by their statistics, their injury histories, their physical profiles. Liam Callaway, 23 years old, promoted from Formula 2 after a season that had broken 3 track records and generated enough media attention to make the board of Apex Racing override their preference for a more experienced second driver. Aggressive style, exceptional car feel, tendency to push beyond the limit and occasionally find it the hard way. Minor shoulder strain in the final race of his F2 season, fully resolved. No significant injury history otherwise. The medical file read like a young man who had not yet had time to break himself. And then there was Marcus Veldon. Thea had not known she would be working with Marcus Veldon when she accepted the job. She had found out 3 days after signing the contract, when a journalist had called her for a comment on the reunion of the year in the Apex garage, and she had hung up without speaking, then sat in her bathroom for 20 minutes with cold water running over her wrists, breathing carefully, reminding herself that she was not the same person she had been 2 years ago. She was not. She had done the work. She had the receipts, metaphorically speaking. 18 months of therapy, a complete restructuring of how she understood her own worth, and the kind of quiet, internal rebuilding that nobody could see from the outside, but that she could feel in the way she woke up in the mornings now without that specific, gray dread that had once been her first companion of every day. Working with Marcus would be professionally straightforward. He was the first driver, the reigning world champion, the axis around which the entire team organization rotated. She would treat him as she would treat any athlete in her care, with competence and clinical distance. She had practiced saying his name in a neutral tone of voice for 2 weeks before flying to the testing circuit. She was ready. What she was not ready for was Liam Callaway. She found him in the driver's room off the main garage, sitting on the edge of a treatment table with his race suit unzipped to the waist, and a look of theatrical boredom on his face that she suspected was manufactured specifically for whoever happened to walk through the door. He was reading something on his phone and didn't look up immediately, and Thea used those few seconds to take him in with the trained, clinical part of her brain that assessed posture, muscle development, potential stress points, range of motion. What she noted: good shoulder development, slightly asymmetric, which was typical for drivers and worth monitoring. Lean, but not undergrown. The kind of physical build that suggested a person who took care of their body not out of vanity, but because they understood it was the primary instrument of their profession. Then he looked up, and the clinical part of her brain took a brief, unauthorized holiday. He had a face that was built for scrutiny, and somehow remained completely comfortable under it. Dark eyes with a quality of attention in them that made you feel, when they were directed at you, that you were the most interesting problem in the room. A slight asymmetry to his expression, the left corner of his mouth carrying a permanent ghost of amusement, as though he were always a half-second from a smile and was exercising considerable willpower to withhold it. "You must be the new physio," he said. His accent had traces of something northern in it, softened by years of living between European racing circuits. "I've been told to be very cooperative with you." "That's encouraging," Thea said, setting her bag down and pulling on her examination gloves with the brisk efficiency she used as armor in situations where she needed to establish the terms of engagement early. "Lie back. I need to assess your shoulder." "Just like that?" "No introduction." "Thea Morrison," she said. "Now lie back." He smiled at that. The full version, not the restrained one, and lay back on the table with the easy compliance of someone who had decided to find this entertaining. She worked methodically, palpating the muscle groups around the shoulder joint that had been strained in his final F2 race, checking for residual tightness, any compensatory patterns he might have developed in the months since the injury. He was, as his file suggested, fully recovered. Better than recovered. Actually, the surrounding musculature was stronger than the baseline readings she'd been given, which suggested either a rehabilitation program more rigorous than the one documented, or simply the natural physical development of a young man at the peak of his conditioning. "You've been working it," she said. "Every day," he confirmed. "I wasn't going to show up to my first F1 preseason with a shoulder that anyone could point to." "Smart. I have my moments." She finished the assessment and made her notes, and when she looked up she found him watching her with that particular quality of attention, the one that had taken a holiday with the clinical part of her brain. "So," he said, "are we going to be friends?" "We're going to be professional," she said. "Which is better than friends, actually. Friends are unpredictable. Professional is consistent." "You say that like you've thought about it." "I have. Extensively." He sat up, pulling the top of his race suit back onto his shoulders. "That sounds like someone who got burned." Thea clicked her pen closed and looked at him directly, which she suspected was what he was hoping for. "Your left rotator cuff will need specific attention during race weekends. I'll put together a protocol for you. You'll have sessions with me before every qualifying and before every race. Outside of those, you'll follow the exercise program I'll email you tonight." "And that's it?" "That's it," she said. "That's the professional version." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, attentive eyes, and she had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation that he was reading something in her face that she hadn't intended to leave visible. "Okay," he said finally. "Professional it is." He slid off the table and picked up his helmet from the chair where he'd left it. "For now," he added, without looking back, and walked out into the noise of the garage. And Thea stood very still for a moment and reminded herself of everything she had decided before getting on that plane. Preseason testing was held at the Circuit de Catalunya outside Barcelona, and the Spanish winter was cold enough to be felt, but not cold enough to be an excuse. The team ran both cars for 3 days, and Thea worked through them systematically. The structured sessions with both drivers, the monitoring and adjustment, the meticulous record-keeping that she knew would form the foundation of her relationship with each athlete across the full season. She met Marcus on the second day. She had been preparing for it since November, and she had the encounter managed. She went to his room, conducted his assessment with focused professionalism, noted that he was in excellent physical condition as the current world champion operating at peak preparedness might be expected to be, and left without any moment that could be called significant. He had looked at her when she walked in with an expression that she remembered very well, the one he used when he was recalibrating his understanding of a situation, and then he had said, "Thea, I didn't know you would be here. Dr. Brennan recruited me," she had said. "I'll need about 40 minutes for your baseline assessment." And he had let her proceed, and she had done her job, and when she left she had gone to the bathroom furthest from his room and breathed slowly and deliberately for approximately 3 minutes, and then she had been fine. What she had not accounted for in her preparations was Liam. He was present in the garage with an energy that was difficult to ignore even when you were professionally committed to ignoring it. He asked questions constantly, about the car's setup, about the track, about the technical regulations, about her exercise protocol, with a genuine curiosity that was different from what she usually encountered in elite athletes, who tended either toward an obsessive self-focus or a studied curiosity about anything not directly relevant to their performance. Liam wanted to understand everything. He wanted to understand why the rehabilitation exercises she'd given him worked the way they did, what the physiological mechanism was, how it connected to the specific demands of driving at sustained high speed. She found herself explaining things she had never been asked to explain before, and discovering in the process that she had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to ask. On the third day of testing, he found her in the medical room at the end of the session, going through her notes, and sat down uninvited on the chair across from her desk. "I have a question," he said. "Is it professional?" "Extremely." She looked up. He had a slight sunburn across the bridge of his nose from the days on the pit wall, and he looked, she thought, with the part of her brain that had still not fully returned from its holiday, entirely too good. "What made you choose this?" he asked. "Sport physio. F1 specifically." She considered deflecting, then considered why she would deflect, then gave him an honest answer because he had asked honestly. "I grew up watching motorsport with my father," she said. "He was a mechanic, not a driver, club-level stuff, nothing like this. But I understood from very early that the human body inside the car was as critical as everything around it, and that nobody was paying enough attention to it. When I qualified, I worked my way toward it deliberately. And the other teams that weren't F1? Building a CV," she said. "This is where I always wanted to be." He nodded slowly, processing this with the same focused attention he brought to everything else. "What do you love about it?" Thea set her pen down. In her previous career phases, she had been careful about this kind of question. She had learned, in one context, she preferred not to think about, that letting someone see what you loved made you vulnerable in ways that could be exploited. But sitting across from Liam Calloway in the late afternoon light of the Circuit de Catalunya medical room, she found she didn't want to perform the carefulness. "The intersection," she said. "The place where the physical and the psychological overlap. You can have a driver who is biomechanically perfect and psychologically fragile, and he'll underperform. You can have one who is carrying a physical issue but has the mental architecture to compensate, and he'll exceed expectations. The interesting work is in understanding which is which and what to do about it." Liam was quiet for a moment. "And what's your read on me? Genuinely want to know? Or fishing for a compliment?" "Genuinely." She looked at him with her honest, clinical attention. "You have the physical capacity to be exceptional. Whether you have the psychological architecture is still unclear because you haven't been tested properly yet. Winning in F2 is winning in F2. This is different." He absorbed this without flinching, which she noted as a point in his favor. Most young drivers asked for reassurance in that moment, dressed up as a desire for honest assessment. He just nodded again, as though she'd given him information to file and act on. "Fair," he said. "Thanks." He stood to leave, and at the door he paused. Not the theatrical pause. She was learning to distinguish them. This one was genuine. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think your read on people is probably your best quality. And I think it probably scares people sometimes." He left, and Thea sat for a long time in the quiet room with her notepad and wondered when, exactly, she had lost control of this situation and whether she'd ever really had it. The season opened in Bahrain, then moved to Saudi Arabia, then to Australia, and the paddock became the landscape Thea lived in. A portable, self-contained world that dismantled itself every 2 weeks and reassembled in a new country with the same internal logic. She found her rhythm. The work was demanding and deeply satisfying in equal measure, the kind of engagement she had hungered for in the quieter years of her practice. Both drivers were physically complex in their own ways. Marcus had years of accumulated tension in his upper back and neck that required consistent management, a consequence of a specific seating position he had developed over a decade and refused to alter despite her gentle recommendations. Liam's shoulder needed ongoing attention, and she found herself developing new approaches to the maintenance protocol as she understood better how his body moved and compensated under the specific stresses of his driving style. She maintained her professional perimeter. She did her job. She avoided any situation with Marcus that could slide from clinical into personal, and she succeeded at this because Marcus, whatever his other qualities, was a pragmatist who understood that the dynamic between them was finished and who seemed content to file it under resolved business. He was cool with her in the way powerful men were cool with things they had already categorized. It didn't pain her. It barely registered. What registered was Liam. He was careful with her, more careful than she had expected from the version of him she'd encountered in the driver's room on the first day. He kept the sessions professional, followed the protocol without complaint, and the questions he asked were always, technically, about the work. But he had a way of being present that altered the quality of a room, a focused, directed attention that she felt even when she was looking at a screen or a set of notes and not at him. After Bahrain, after Saudi Arabia, after Melbourne, she admitted to herself, privately, internally, in the honest space she tried to maintain inside herself, that she was paying him a quality of attention she did not pay to other people. That when she heard his voice in the garage, something in her body adjusted its orientation the way a compass needle finds north. She did not act on this. She had built her professional life, in this post-Marcus era, on the understanding that what she felt and what she did were not required to be the same thing, and that the discipline of keeping them separate was one of the more important skills she had developed. She was proud of this skill. She intended to keep exercising it. Monaco arrived in May, trailing its particular mythology and particular demands. The circuit wound through the streets of the city with a claustrophobia that was entirely at odds with what Formula One cars were designed to do. The barriers were closer here than anywhere else. The margin for error was essentially theoretical, and the qualifying sessions that determined grid position were more consequential at Monaco than at any other race on the calendar, because overtaking during the race itself was nearly impossible. Liam had been building steadily through the season's early rounds, points in every race. A sixth place in Melbourne that the technical team analyzed with considerable excitement, a strong fourth in Spain. The team's internal assessments had shifted in their tone around him. The gamble of the promotion from F2 was looking less like a gamble. Theo watched his progress with the particular, careful pride of someone who understood exactly how much work had gone into each result and who was not in a position to express that pride in any of the more natural ways it might find release. Qualifying day at Monaco was brutal. The session was running in its final minutes when Liam's flying lap, which was, by the sector times, shaping into something potentially extraordinary, was destroyed. Marcus, on a slower outlap, moved across the racing line at the entry to Casino Square at precisely the moment Liam arrived there at full qualifying speed, forcing Liam into a sequence of corrections that lost him 3/10 and the chance at the front row. It was not, technically, a foul. It was the kind of thing that experienced drivers did to less experienced ones, the application of track knowledge as a form of aggression dressed as incompetence. The stewards reviewed it and found no case to answer. Liam would start 7th. Theo was not present for the immediate aftermath in the garage, where she understood from the controlled tone of the radio communications that the situation was being managed very carefully by people who were paid to manage it. She was in the medical room preparing for the evening's post-qualifying checks when she heard the door and looked up to find Liam standing in the frame, still in his race suit, helmet under one arm, and his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen on him before, a cold, tightly wound fury that he was working very hard to contain. She put down what she was in the middle of and said, simply, "Come in." He sat down on the treatment table and looked at the floor for a moment, and she let him, because some things needed to be given the space they required before they could be touched. "He did it on purpose," Liam said, finally. His voice was level, but she could hear the effort it was costing him. "I know," she said, "and it's going to count for nothing. No penalty, no acknowledgement. He's the champion, so it was just a misjudgment." "Yes. And tomorrow I have to race behind him from 7th and watch him go." "Yes." He looked up at her. The fury had shifted slightly into something rawer. "Is this what it is? Is this what the whole season is going to be? Because if it is, I need to know now, so I can adjust my understanding of the situation." Thea moved to the cabinet and began setting up the recovery session materials, the treatment tools she would use to work through the muscular tension that a hard qualifying session left in his shoulders and neck and the muscles of his forearms. She did this methodically, and when she spoke she chose her words with the care she always brought to moments where the right thing needed to be said precisely. "What Marcus did today was a message," she said. "He's telling you that he's watching you, that he considers you a threat, and that he's willing to play outside the lines of what the sport pretends are its values. That's information." She turned to him. "The answer to information is never panic. It's adjustment." "What kind of adjustment?" "Patience," she said. "On the track. And the kind of performance that makes what he did today look like desperation rather than dominance." Liam was quiet for a moment, watching her. "Lie down," she said. "Let me work through the shoulder." He lay back, and she began, and for a while the only sound in the room was the ambient noise of the circuit outside and the technical focus of her work. She felt his body gradually release the held tension as the session progressed. She was good at this, at finding the specific places where stress had settled itself and coaxing the muscles to let it go. She had been doing it for long enough that she'd developed what she privately thought of as a language for it, a nonverbal conversation with the body's own responses. After a while, Liam said, quietly, "Can I ask you something? Why do you care about getting this right? The answer you gave me, patience, adjustment, playing the long game. Why does it matter to you that I understand that? You could just do your job." Fia's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed. "I think," she said, slowly, "that it matters to me because I understand what it costs to be inside a situation that isn't fair and to let the unfairness make your decisions for you. I've done it, and the consequences are longer lasting than the moment." Liam turned his head slightly to look at her, though the angle made it awkward. "Marcus," he said, not a question. She felt the word move through her differently than she would have expected. Not with pain, exactly. With the specific weight of something that was genuinely in the past and was being acknowledged as such for the first time in a setting that made it real. "Among other things," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry. Don't be. It was the making of me, in a backwards way. Most of the things that are actually useful about who I am now came from surviving something I shouldn't have had to survive." Her hands moved through the finish of the session, and she helped him sit up, and they were closer than they usually were in the transition. The geometry of the table and the room and the end of the work brought them to approximately 18 inches apart, and neither of them moved to increase that distance. Liam looked at her with the fullness of his attention, the version that she had been carefully not receiving for months, and she found that she was receiving it now without the armor that usually deflected it. "Fia," he said, "I know what you said about professional. I know what I said," she agreed. "And I meant it. And, she said, intentions and outcomes are not always the same thing." He kissed her with a deliberateness that she found afterwards she couldn't characterize as impulsive, because it contained none of the quality of impulse. It was considered and honest and careful in a way that left no room for the usual self-protective story about how these things happened by accident. She kissed him back, and the story she had been telling herself for months about the adequate sufficiency of professional distance became, in that moment, not false exactly, but beside the point. What followed was not an accident. Neither of them pretended it was. They lay in the dark of her hotel room with the sounds of Monaco's night coming through the window, the distant music from somewhere along the port, the occasional surge of traffic, the city going on with its ordinary life, entirely indifferent to the fact that something significant had just happened in a room on the 5th floor of a mid-range hotel a kilometer from the race circuit, and talked in the way people talk when they have stopped performing and started being honest, the quiet, directional conversation of two people who are working out together what they actually think. "We need to think about this," Thea said. She was lying on her back looking at the ceiling. Liam was on his side looking at her. "I've been thinking about it since Barcelona," he said. "I mean practically," she said. "In terms of what this means. What the contract says." She had read the relevant clauses. She had read them in November, not because she had been anticipating this, but because she had been the kind of person who read the relevant clauses in contracts before situations arose, a quality that her therapist had once described as the healthy version of anxiety. The Apex Racing Code of Conduct was explicit on the subject of personal relationships between team staff and drivers. The prohibition fell not under any moral category, but under a specific conflict of interest policy. The logic being that a physiotherapist in a romantic relationship with a driver could not be trusted to make objective clinical decisions, that the team's competitive interests required its medical staff to operate without personal entanglement, and that discovery of such a relationship would constitute a serious violation of professional conduct sufficient to terminate employment without. Notice, the consequences for the driver were similarly explicit. A financial penalty, and a formal review of conduct under the team's internal regulations, which at minimum meant several weeks of mandatory administrative process during which racing participation could be suspended. "If anyone finds out," she said, "I lose this job. Immediately. And you take a hit to your season that you can't afford right now." Liam was quiet for a moment. "So we don't let anyone find out," he said. She turned her head to look at him. You understand what that means? It means nothing. No visible anything. On track we're driver and physiotherapist, full stop. I understand. And you're comfortable with that? He considered it seriously, which she appreciated. I'm not comfortable with it, he said. Comfortable isn't the word. But I understand why it's necessary, and I'm not going to let it matter more than what this is. What is this? He looked at her without any of the strategic ambiguity she had learned to expect from people in similar conversations. I think you know what it is, he said. She did. The European swing of the calendar was a sequence of circuits she knew well from the academic study of the sport: Silverstone, Spa, Monza, Budapest, Zandvoort, and she knew them now with the additional, entirely different intimacy of living inside the machinery that made the sport function. The double life they had agreed to was, in its way, straightforward to maintain because the professional one was so consuming. The race weekends were dense with obligation, every hour accounted for, the interactions between staff and drivers happening in full view of cameras and journalists and the hundreds of other people who made up the traveling circus of an F1 team. On the surface of things, Liam Callaway and Thea Morrison were a driver and his physiotherapist, the relationship between them competent and warm in the impersonal way of good working relationships, and nobody who watched them in the garage or the pit lane would have found anything to examine. In the private life, the hotels after the circuit had gone quiet, the early mornings before the team day began, the careful navigation of which floor to take the lift to, something else was happening. She had not understood, before this, that it was possible to have both at once. The rigorous, satisfying professional life that she had built and the personal warmth that she had believed, in the 2 years since Marcus, was incompatible with the life she had chosen. She had operated on the conviction, tested by experience, that she was someone who could not have both, who would always have to sacrifice one for the other, and who had chosen, correctly, the professional over the personal. Liam was rearranging that conviction quietly and persistently, the way water works on stone, by simply being there and being what he was. The race results were moving in directions that were drawing the attention of the entire paddock. At Zandvoort, Liam qualified third, his best result to date, and drove a race of such measured, patient precision that he finished second, on the podium for the first time in his Formula One career. The post-race atmosphere in the Apex garage was extraordinary, the kind of collective release that only came when something that had been predicted and hoped for and half-believed arrived as actual fact. Thea was present for it in her professional capacity, and she watched Liam on the podium, the champagne, the noise, the television cameras finding his face, and felt a specific pride that she could not explain to anyone and didn't need to. He found her eyes across the garage when he returned, just for a moment, with a look that was so briefly and perfectly honest that she felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, and then they both looked away and went back to the professional version of themselves. Marcus finished fourth. He stood at the far end of the garage with a stillness that she recognized. She had seen it before, in the later period of their relationship, when things were not going as he intended and he was processing the adjustment required. He was watching Liam with an expression that was entirely neutral on the surface, and, she knew from extensive experience, was not neutral at all. In Silverstone, 3 races later, it began to unravel. She didn't know at first that anything had shifted. Liam was late for his pre-race session. Unusual, but not unprecedented. The morning of a British Grand Prix was logistically complex, and timing could slip. And when he arrived, he was carrying something different in his body language, a quality of tension that wasn't physical. She noted it, but didn't probe immediately. She worked through the session, and when she had finished and was making her notes, he spoke first. "How long were you with Marcus?" he asked. The question arrived in a particular tone that she had enough experience to recognize, the tone of a question that has been waiting to be asked and has finally run out of patience. 18 months, she said. She had told him this already, in Monaco. She had been honest about it from the beginning. "And you came here knowing he was here." "I found out after I signed the contract," she said. "I told you this." "Yes." He was looking at his hands, not at her. "Someone told me something last night." "Who?" "Doesn't matter who." She put down her pen. "It matters to me." He looked up. "Marcus." He was in the hotel bar, and I was there, and we talked. He paused. "He said you always gravitated to winners. That you were strategic about it." He implied that what was happening between us was about proximity to him. Some kind of. He made it sound like a pattern. Thea was quiet for a moment. With the specific, practiced quietness she had developed in therapy, the pause before response that prevented reaction from becoming escalation. She was aware of what Marcus had done and why he had done it, and how precisely calibrated it was. She was also aware that Liam was sitting across from her with genuine doubt on his face, the uncertainty of a young man who had been given a narrative and was trying to decide whether it fit what he knew. "Do you believe him?" she asked. Liam met her eyes. "I don't want to," he said. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She thought about what to say and chose honesty over reassurance. "What Marcus said about me and patterns, he's interpreting my life through his own framework. The way I ended up near him was through a professional path that I had been building independently for years. The way I ended up here is the same thing. The connection between those two facts is that I'm good at my job and I work hard and I end up at the highest level of the sport because that's where my career has taken me." She paused. "The connection is not him." Liam didn't respond immediately. She could see him working through it, the specific cognitive effort of someone trying to separate what they feel from what they can verify. "Okay," he said finally. It wasn't convinced exactly, but it was choosing to proceed. She watched him leave and then sat for a long time in the quiet room, because she understood that Marcus had planted something, and that plants had a way of growing whether you intended them to or not, and that the next thing that went wrong would water it. The next thing that went wrong was Belgium. Spa-Francorchamps was the kind of circuit that sorted drivers into categories: those who found its combination of high speed and elevation changes and variable weather conditions hostile, and those who found it natural. Liam was the second kind. His car feel, which had always been his most discussed quality, was particularly acute on a track where reading the surface and the grip level through the steering column was more important than anywhere else on the calendar. He had qualified second, and there was a real and discussed possibility, in the team's strategic planning sessions, that a race win was achievable. Something was different in him. She felt it in the morning session. The tension that had begun in Silverstone had not resolved but had compounded, and she found herself adjusting the session instinctively, trying to work through it, aware that the physical and psychological were not separate in the way that non-practitioners sometimes believed, and that what was in his head was also, to some extent, in his shoulders. He was, she realized, not present in the way he usually was. He was in a version of the race that hadn't happened yet, running calculations and scenarios with an urgency that was displacing his usual measured focus. She said none of this. It was not a moment for the observation to land well. The race started. She watched from the pit wall with Dr. Brennan, her eyes on the timing screens and the television feed that showed the onboard cameras from both cars. For the first 20 laps, it looked like the race Liam had planned. He was patient, managing the gap to Marcus ahead of him, waiting for the pit window to create the opportunity for an undercut. Then on lap 23, at the top of Rydillen, Marcus ran slightly wide at the exit, the kind of imprecision that happened once in 10,000 kilometers at his level. And Liam, who in the previous version of himself would have filed this as information for later, put his car alongside. He was alongside. And Marcus, who knew exactly where the car was and exactly what he was doing, moved across. It was later ruled a racing incident. The speeds involved were such that when Liam's front wing made contact with Marcus's rear tire, the resulting forces were distributed through his car in a way that sent it sideways at approximately 240 kilometers per hour. The gravel trap at Rydillen existed precisely for this reason. It slowed the car before the barrier, and the Hans device and the halo and the seat construction and all the accumulated engineering wisdom of half a century of making this sport survivable meant that Liam stepped out of the car on his own 2 feet, which was the only thing that mattered in the first 60 seconds. Thea was in the medical center before the safety car had completed its first lap. She had not run. She had moved at the fastest walk that remained under control, which was a discipline she had practiced in her first years working in professional sport, because running communicated. Panic was not useful. Dr. Brennan was with her. They had a protocol. They followed it. Liam was assessed. The shoulder, the left one, the one she knew like a piece of geography, had taken a significant impact. Not a tear, the initial assessment suggested, but severe bruising to the labrum, possible inflammation, the need for imaging to rule out anything more structural. He was coherent, his vitals were stable, his recall of the incident was clear. He was, the medical summary would later read, extraordinarily fortunate. He was also furious in a way that she understood as a stage of the adrenaline process and tried to treat as such. When she approached to complete her part of the assessment, he looked at her with an expression that contained things she had not seen in his face before. The specific look of someone who has been frightened past their limit and has arrived on the other side of the fright in a landscape of misplaced anger that is looking for direction. "Don't," he said, not loudly, but with a finality that she felt in her sternum. She stopped. "Liam, I almost died out there." "I know. Because I was in my head about." He stopped himself. "Because I wasn't where I needed to be." He looked at her, and in his face she saw the seed that Marcus had planted in Silverstone, now watered by adrenaline and pain into something bigger than the truth warranted. "And I need to not be in this room right now," he said. "Okay," she said. She stepped back. She let the technicians complete the assessment and said nothing else to him. The team decided that evening, after imaging confirmed the labrum bruising and a structural scan cleared him of anything more serious, that Liam would miss the next race as a precautionary measure. The team principal made additional references to the undisciplined and dangerous nature of the overtake attempt, and the message in the paddock was clear. Liam Callaway had made a mistake. The mistake had nearly been catastrophic, and the consequences would include sitting on the sidelines and considering the decisions that had led him there. Thea gave him space that evening and the next morning, because she had enough self-knowledge to understand that pursuing the conversation while he was in pain and shock and anger would accomplish nothing except making the conversation about her. The race she watched from the pit wall was won by Marcus. She absorbed this with the flat recognition of a situation developing in the direction it had been designed to develop. That evening, Liam knocked on her hotel room door. He stood in the corridor with his left arm in a sling and an expression that was different from any she had seen on him before. The specific, exhausted look of someone who has been in a long argument with themselves and has arrived at the far end of it without having convinced anyone. "I said things," he started. "You didn't say anything," she said. "I'm the one who should have been clearer, earlier, about what I knew about Marcus and what to expect from him." He shook his head. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He sat down heavily in the room's desk chair and looked at the floor with the weariness of the last few days evident in every line of his body. "What he said to me in Silverstone," Liam said. "I knew it wasn't true. I knew it when he said it. But I let it live in my head, and it got between me and what I was doing, and I went for an overtake I had no business attempting at that moment because I was trying to prove something, and I nearly..." He stopped. She waited. "I nearly got killed proving something to myself about a story someone else made up about you," he said. "That's what happened. Liam, I'm sorry." The apology contained everything it needed to contain. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed closest to his chair and looked at him with the honesty that she had discovered, over these months, was the only currency that worked between them. "We're okay," she said. "But we need to talk about Marcus. Properly. Because what happened in Silverstone is not the last move he's going to make." She was right. The next move came 9 days later, and it was the one she had not planned for, because she had underestimated how far Marcus was willing to go. She was alone in the physiotherapy room at the Apex Racing Factory in September, the team's UK base, a recovery week between the summer races and the final sprint of the season, when the door opened without a knock and Marcus walked in. She had not seen him one-on-one since Belgium. She had conducted his post-race assessment with the same clinical efficiency she applied to everything, and they had maintained the civilized, minimal professional surface that had characterized their interactions all season. But the man who walked into her room now was not the one she had been successfully managing since January. He was carrying something, a folder, and she felt the specific cold feeling of premonition. He set the folder on the desk in front of her without speaking and waited, with the particular patience of someone who knows they have something to show and wants to watch the moment of recognition. She opened it. Photographs. 5 of them. The image quality suggested a telephoto lens, long distance, compressed slightly in the way of surveillance photography. They showed, in a sequence across 3 separate race weekends that she could identify by the visible signage in the backgrounds, herself and Liam, leaving the same hotel lift. In one, The angle and the visible doorframe made the situation unambiguous in the way that a picture was worth 1,000 words of denial. She closed the folder and looked at Marcus. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, his expression the one that she thought of as his public face. Handsome, collected, carrying a faint suggestion of authority that he wore as naturally as clothing. "There are copies," he said. "So you understand this isn't about the originals. What do you want?" She kept her voice level. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, and her mind was moving fast through the implications. But she understood, from everything she knew about Marcus and about situations like this one, that the thing he wanted from her was to see the fear, and she was not going to give it to him. "I want you to do what's best for everyone," he said. "Resign. Write the letter today. Cite personal reasons, family obligation, something vague and clean. You leave the team. You leave the paddock. I don't care what you do after that." Thea, genuinely. "But you and Liam Calloway stop. You leave, and these photographs cease to be of interest to anyone." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if I don't?" He picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm. "Then the team owner gets a copy and legal gets involved. You're both in clear violation of the conflict of interest provisions in your contracts. For you, immediate dismissal, no reference, and your name in the paddock becomes associated with the kind of professional conduct that closes doors permanently. For Liam." He paused, and she could hear the precision of someone who had thought this through carefully. "A formal conduct review under the team regulations, financial penalties, and a suspension during the review process. He loses race starts. He loses points. He loses the momentum he's been building all season. And at 23, when his reputation is the most fragile and most important thing he has, it becomes a different kind of story than the one he's been writing." He said it with absolute, practiced calm. "I'd rather you just resigned," he said. "It's simpler for everyone." He left. She sat for a very long time. The September afternoon light moved across the room, and she sat in it and thought, with the focused, unsentimental clarity that she had learned to apply to problems that were too large for feelings, about what she was going to do. She thought about calling Liam. She thought about calling Dr. Brennan. She thought about the clause in the contract and the photographs and the specific fragility of a career that was 23 years old and had just had its first brilliant season and had not yet accumulated the kind of insulation that protected established champions from this kind of damage. She thought about all the things that Liam's second season would be if it didn't start with a conduct review and a suspension and a press narrative that turned him from a promising talent into a cautionary story about the wrong choices young drivers made off the track. And she made a decision. She sat with it for 4 hours, ate something without tasting it, walked around the outside of the building twice, and came back to the same conclusion. Then she called Liam. She had prepared what she was going to say. She said it, and she said it cleanly and without hesitation, because she had learned that the kindest way to do a hard thing was to do it completely, without pulling the blow at the last second and drawing it out. "I think what we were doing was a mistake," she said. "I think it was bad judgment on my part, and I'm sorry for letting it develop as far as it did. I'm going to resign from the team." Liam was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she had to resist the impulse to fill the silence. "What happened?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Nothing happened. I've been thinking about this for a while. Thea, Liam, I've made my decision. I need you to respect it." Another silence, longer and different in quality. "Okay," he said, finally, and his voice contained something she had not heard in it before, the flat, extinguished sound of a certainty being taken away. She wrote the letter that evening. She cited personal reasons. She made it clean and vague and entirely without detail, and she submitted it to the team's HR department and received an acknowledgement within the hour. The next morning, she packed her room at the factory accommodation and drove to the airport. On the plane, she allowed herself the only moment of the kind she had refused in the room with Marcus. She put her head against the window and closed her eyes and felt, briefly and entirely, the full weight of what it cost to protect someone from something they didn't know they needed protecting from. She found a sublet flat in London. She updated her CV. She made calls to her network and found, as she had expected, that her reputation had not been visibly damaged. She had left the team cleanly, and the public version of events was simply a departure, one of dozens that happened in the paddock every season. She began rebuilding. She was good at rebuilding. She had done it before. She missed him with a precision and a physical specificity that she had not expected. She had thought, having gone through Marcus, that she understood grief and loss and the way a significant absence registered in the body. She discovered that she had not understood it at all, because what she had felt when Marcus ended was something closer to relief. Under the grief, a sense of enormous weight being put down. What she felt without Liam was different, a specific loss of orientation, as though something that had been providing north had been removed, and she was having to relearn navigation from scratch. In the third week after leaving, she watched the Singapore Grand Prix from her sofa at 11 at night, the flat dark around her, a cup of tea gone cold on the table beside her. She had not planned to watch. She had told herself she would go to bed at a reasonable hour and not subject herself to the particular quality of pain that she expected the broadcast would produce. She had turned it on at the formation lap and had not turned it off. Liam qualified 9th. He finished 12th. The broadcast team discussed his difficult phase in the careful, non-committal language that sports commentary used when something was clearly wrong and nobody wanted to be the one to say so. She watched the in-car footage from his onboard camera during the middle stint of the race, the sector times displayed in the corner of the screen, the steering inputs visible in the movement of the camera, and she could see it. She could see the hesitation at the entry to the fast corners, the slightly conservative braking points, the half-second of doubt that he had never had before. She had watched enough of his racing across the season to know the difference between Liam being careful and Liam not being entirely present, and what she was watching was the second thing. She turned off the television before the podium ceremony. She did not need to watch Marcus lift the trophy. In the fourth week, she sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a coffee. She wasn't drinking and a laptop she wasn't using and understood, with the clear-eyed honesty that was one of the harder-won qualities of the last 2 years, that what she was doing was not rebuilding. It was enduring. There was a difference, and she knew it. She had chosen this. She had made the choice consciously and with full information, and she would make it again. But the fact that a choice was correct did not make it painless, and she had been confusing the correctness of the decision with the acceptability of the pain it produced, which was a category error she could now see clearly. She opened her laptop and updated 2 more entries in her professional contacts spreadsheet and sent an email about a consulting inquiry that had come in. She was thorough and efficient about it. Then she closed the laptop and sat at the table for a while longer and let herself feel what she felt, which was the thing her therapist had always told her was the precondition of moving through it. Javier Santos had been with Apex Racing for 6 years, and he was not, by nature, a person who interfered in situations that were not his business. He was compact and precise and from Seville, and he approached problems the way he approached the mechanical systems he worked on, with patience and the understanding that rushing an assessment produced bad outcomes. He had been fond of Thea in the way that people in intense professional environments sometimes became fond of colleagues who were competent and honest and who treated the work with the seriousness it deserved. He had noticed, from the week she left, that something was wrong in the team in a way that went beyond the loss of a good staff member. He had watched Liam's results collapse and had formed a theory, the way he always formed theories, quietly, over time, by accumulating small observations into a pattern. He hadn't been trying to find out anything specific. He had been working late in the factory garage the week after Singapore, alone on a component calibration issue that required silence and concentration, when he heard voices in the corridor outside the commercial director's office. The conversation was not intended to be overheard. He had not intended to hear it. But the walls of the Apex Racing factory were less soundproof than the 9-figure budget suggested they should be, and what he heard was enough of the shape of something to make the rest of the pattern clear. He sat with it for 2 weeks. He had a job he valued and a mortgage and a daughter in school in Barcelona, and getting involved in something that was, technically, between 3 adults in a situation he had not been part of, was not obviously his responsibility. He thought about it the way he thought about the component calibration issue. What was the failure mode of not acting, and was it worse than the failure mode of acting incorrectly? He called Thea on a Sunday evening in October, 6 weeks after she had left the team, 4 races before Abu Dhabi. "Thea, it's Javi," she answered, and he told her what he knew. He was clear about the limits of it. He had heard enough to understand the shape, not enough to have a transcript. But what he had heard, combined with what he had observed across the season, was sufficient. He could see her processing it through the quality of her silence. "I'm going to tell Liam," he said when he had finished. "Javi, I'm going to tell him," he said calmly. "Because I've worked for that team for 6 years, and I'm done covering for things that shouldn't be covered. And because he's driving like someone who doesn't know why he lost something. And that's worse than driving like someone who knows and is angry about it." A pause. "I'm going to wait until Abu Dhabi," he said. "Not because I want to be dramatic about it. Because I want him to have enough time to process it and still be able to race. If I tell him 4 weeks out, he'll have 4 weeks of carrying it, and that's too long. I'll tell him the week of." "Javi." She stopped. "Thank you," she said, finally. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll be in touch." Abu Dhabi. The Yas Marina circuit in late November, the last race of the Formula One season, the point at which the calendar that had begun in Bahrain in March collapsed to its conclusion and the year's scores were settled. Thea had a ticket. She had bought it 6 weeks earlier, in a moment she now classified as a refusal to disappear entirely from the thing she loved, and she had not been sure until the morning of the race whether she would actually use it. She used it. She sat in the paddock club. Javi had arranged the credential through the kind of quiet, efficient favor calling that she had come to understand was one of his primary professional skills, and watched the pre-race preparation from the controlled vantage point of the hospitality area that looked down on the pit lane. She was nursing a coffee she didn't need when she heard footsteps she recognized. Not because there was anything distinctive about his footsteps, but because her body had developed, across the months of the season, a specific and involuntary awareness of him that she had never quite managed to turn off. She turned. Liam was standing 10 feet away, still in the base layer he wore under the race suit, the suit itself half open and folded down to his waist. He had come from the motorhome. He had, she understood, looking at him, been looking for her. His face, when he found her, did something that she felt the echo of across the space between them. "Javi told me," he said. Around them, the hospitality area was populated with team guests and sponsors and paddock personnel, all going about the pre-race business of a season finale. None of them were paying attention to a driver talking to a woman in a corner. "I know," she said. What he said, what Marcus did. He stopped. He had the expression of someone who has spent time with a thing and arrived at the far side of it in a different place than where he started. "You protected me," he said. "I made a decision," she said. "That was the right one given the information I had. You could have told me. You could have let me decide. I know. I should have. That was the part that wasn't right." He looked at her. The pre-race noise was building outside. The pit lane announcements, the crowd finding its volume, the distant sound of cars in the warm-up sequence. He had perhaps 45 minutes before he needed to be on the grid. "There are a lot of things I want to say," he said, "and not enough time to say them before I need to drive a race." "Then say the one that matters most." He didn't hesitate. "I'm sorry. For Silverstone, and for Belgium, and for every moment when I let someone else's story about you be louder than what I knew." She looked at him for a long moment. "Go drive," she said. "Go drive the race well. And then come back, and we'll say the rest of it. And if I win..." She felt the corner of her mouth move. "If you win, you do everything that winning requires. The podium, the press, the team, all of it. And then you come find me." He held her gaze for another moment, with the full, unguarded quality of his attention that she had spent a season taking in small, rationed doses. "I'm going to win," he said. "I know," she said. He walked back through the hospitality area and was absorbed by the machinery of the race day. And Thea turned back to the pit lane view and the coffee she didn't need, and breathed. The race was 58 laps. She watched all of them. In the early stages, Marcus ran first and Liam sat in third, managing the gap, not spending tires, waiting with a patience that she recognized as the thing she had said to him in Monaco, the specific quality of a person who has stopped needing to prove something and has started simply doing what they know how to do. At the first pit stop cycle, Liam emerged second, the undercut working cleanly on the driver who had been between them. Marcus was 3 seconds ahead. On lap 31, Marcus took the safety car restart aggressively and gained a second and a half, and the broadcast team discussed the arithmetic of the remaining laps with the carefully neutral tension of people who knew which outcome made a better story. On lap 44, Liam set the fastest lap of the race. Then he set it again on lap 46. The gap was down to 1.2 seconds. "Thea," sitting in the hospitality area with her credentials and an untouched second coffee, was entirely still. She had been doing this, the deliberate stillness, since the first lap, because movement was what the anxiety wanted and the anxiety was not in charge. On lap 54 of 58, Liam was in Marcus's mirrors. What happened next occurred over the course of approximately 4 seconds. Liam feinted left at the approach to the final chicane. The move Marcus had to respect, because Liam had the pace and the tires and the willingness, and Marcus adjusted, and the adjustment was the fraction that the car didn't have, and Liam went right and was through. Through cleanly, through brilliantly, through in the way that it was done when someone was not proving anything to anyone, but simply doing what they were capable of. He crossed the line 4 seconds ahead. Thea did not cry, which she was aware was unusual, but which felt right, because what she felt was not the liquid, overflow emotion of something sad becoming good, but something solider. The specific, deep satisfaction of watching a person achieve what they were capable of when everything unnecessary had been cleared away and they were simply themselves. Around her, the hospitality area produced the noise that a room full of people made when a thing they had been watching for 58 laps arrived at a conclusion that justified the watching, and she sat in the middle of it and felt entirely, precisely calm. She found Javi in the paddock later, after she had navigated through the controlled chaos of a season-ending race day with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a year learning exactly how this machinery worked. He hugged her with the uncomplicated warmth of a genuine friend and told her she looked different. Different how? She asked. Like yourself, he said. The podium ceremony was broadcast on the enormous screens around the circuit. She watched it from the paddock edge with the press credential Javi had provided. The national anthems, the champagne, the formal version of triumph that Formula One had refined across decades into something between sport and performance. And then the interviews, the ring of microphones and cameras, the questions from journalists who knew the season's narrative and were already constructing the post-race version of it. Liam stood in front of the microphones with the trophy and the smile and the still damp champagne and said the expected things about the car, about the team, about the season. And then one of the journalists asked about the dropped results in the middle of the season, the weeks when the gap had been closing and the title had seemed to be slipping, and what had changed. He looked at the camera. The specific camera. She could see him identify it. The one that was going out live, the one with the red light. And he looked into it. I lost someone important to me, he said. And I found out today what it actually cost her to leave. And I need to say publicly that what happened in this team this season was not only about what happened on the track, and that there are people in this paddock whose character is very different from the one they perform in public. A pause. The journalists were doing the thing journalists did when someone was saying something that was not in the script, staying very still, not interrupting, not risking the break of the moment. I'm dedicating this championship to Thea Morrison, Liam said, who saved my season and my career and a number of other things, and who deserved better from the people around her and from me. Thea, standing at the paddock edge with Javi's hand on her shoulder, watched this on the large screen and felt the reality of 12 million simultaneous viewers trained on a moment that had been entirely private until 30 seconds ago, and found that she was completely unafraid of it. Marcus's season ended in a way that was, she supposed, proportionate. The team principal's statement 2 days later referenced an internal investigation into conduct and the use of company resources for personal purposes. 3 sponsors withdrew from the Apex Racing partnership within a week. The details that came out, through Javi's account to the team's legal representatives, through the statements of 2 other team members who had been aware of the photographs, and who were now consumed by the particular guilt of the complicit, were damaging in the specific way that public exposure of private malfeasance was always damaging to people who had built their reputation on a version of themselves that required maintenance. Marcus Veldon's public identity had been carefully constructed across a decade. The professional champion, the controlled excellence, the sport's most reliable winner. What replaced it in the press cycle was not a villain narrative, exactly, but something worse for a person of his particular psychology. A complicated, ambiguous story, the kind that ended not with clear condemnation, but with a permanent question mark attached to a name. The sponsorship withdrawals said more than any editorial. He would race again, she supposed. He would find a team, and he would be competitive because his talent was real and independent of his character. but the specific version of Marcus Veldon that had walked the paddock as its most assured figure was gone. It occurred to her, thinking about it later, that she felt almost nothing about this. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something closer to neutrality, which was perhaps the clearest sign of how thoroughly she had finished with that chapter of her life. She was, by that point, busy with other things. The offer from Meridian Motorsport came within 10 days of Abu Dhabi. Meridian were Apex Racing's closest challenger on the constructors' side, a team with different values and a culture that people in the paddock described, consistently and without sarcasm, as a place where people wanted to go to work. The head of performance called her personally and offered a role that was, in every structural sense, better than what she had left. More resource, more autonomy, and an explicit acknowledgement that she would be operating as a full member of the technical staff rather than as a service provider to it. She accepted on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in her London flat with a cup of tea, and felt the specific, quiet pleasure of a door opening in the direction you had hoped. Liam's transfer to Meridian was announced the following week. It had, from what she understood through the paddock networks that she had maintained even from a distance, been in progress for some time. The Abu Dhabi race, and the public statements that followed it, had accelerated conversations that had already been happening, and both parties had wanted a resolution before the new year. His announcement photograph was taken in the Meridian garage. She saw it on her phone at 7 in the morning, shared across the various group messages that made up her professional social life, and studied it with the particular, knowledgeable attention of someone who could read a driver's physical state from a photograph, and who could also, additionally, just look at a face and know what was in it. He looked, she thought, like himself. They had spoken several times since Abu Dhabi. Properly, at length, with none of the careful management of an earlier stage of things. The conversations had the quality she associated with genuinely honest communication. The productive discomfort of saying real things to someone who was actually listening. The specific intimacy of two people who had gone through something together and were deciding to continue. "I want to do this properly," he had said. "Not secretly. Properly." "I know," she said. "I do too. And you're not. You don't feel like the public announcement thing was, it was unexpected," she said. "And quite large. And I'm still processing it. But okay." "Yes," she said. "Okay." The winter in Spain was mild. The Circuit de Catalunya in February had a quality she had not experienced before. She had arrived the previous year as a newcomer, and she arrived now as something different, not just professionally, but in the way she inhabited the space. She knew the garage and the medical room and the mechanics and the engineers. She knew how the morning light fell across the pit lane and how the late afternoon turned the mountains in the distance a particular shade of blue. She knew what the fuel smelled like and how the tires sounded and what the specific frequency of an F1 engine at idle meant about the car's current state. On the first day of preseason testing, she completed her setup of the Meridian Medical Facility, organized her materials, reviewed both drivers' baseline assessments, and prepared for the season with the organized focus that was her professional mode. At 2 in the afternoon, when the morning session had finished and the garage was moving through its midday reset, she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up. Liam was standing in the doorway, not in his race suit. The afternoon session hadn't started yet, just himself, in team kit, looking at her with the expression that had no performance in it. "New facility," he said. "How is it?" "Better storage," she said. "Improved lighting. I'll need to adjust the layout slightly for optimal workflow." Obviously, he came in and looked around at the clean, ordered space, and she watched him doing it with the attention she no longer had any particular reason to moderate. "Ready for the season?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You?" He turned to look at her, and she knew what was in the expression, had known it since she had first learned to read it, in a different facility, in a different team, over a year ago. "Yes," he said. Later, when the circuit had gone quiet and the testing day had finished and the team had cleared out to their hotels, they walked the pit lane side by side in the early evening, the track empty and lit and extending ahead of them in both directions. The circuit's geometry visible in a way it never was when it was occupied by the machinery and people that gave it its purpose. She had her jacket and he had his, and the Spanish February air was cool without being cold, and neither of them talked for a while, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he was comfortable with silence in a way that rare people were, that he didn't fill it with the noise of performance. New start, he said eventually. Same sport, she said, but cleaner. He looked at her sideways. That's almost optimistic. I'm revising upward, she said. It's a process. He found her hand in the dark of the pit lane and held it, which was a simple thing and the only one that was needed, and they walked the rest of the length of the straight in the quiet of a circuit after hours, free and unobserved, and no longer needing to be anything other than what they were.